What's up guys, ZiSotto here, and today we're making an updated tier list of a different kind, or rather not a tier list, a guard list by power curve. I've made one of these in the past. I've talked about guards by power curve, I think 3 years ago at this point, and since then we've had quite a few new releases, quite a few things have changed about various guards, and I think it's worth addressing this again after multiple people have asked me to do so. And as such, you can see here the list is a little different from what you'd normally have. We have an early game bracket, then early to mid game, mid game to late game, and late game guards, as well as all-rounder guards that are just consistent throughout most of the game. So disregard the S, plus, whatever. That doesn't matter here for us. It's just about the bracket in the game these guards are in. And we're going to go through them in the order they're here, just, because that's how they are. And I'm going to try and keep this brief, but long enough to give a quick explanation for every guard. So the ones that are not here yet, as far as I know, are Set and Horus. I'm going to see real quick if Yomaganda is here already. Yes. So I can briefly talk about them beforehand. I think Horus especially is probably going to be an all-rounder, because Horus has a lot of potential for early game aggression and early game sustain in lane, combo potential and all that through his main kit. And then his ultimate has massive late game potential. He would otherwise fall off a little bit in late game, but the plays that can be made with his ultimate in late stages of the game are absolutely insane. So I think he does a bit of everything. With Set, on the other hand, in his current state, I think he is an early to mid game guard. He has pretty good clear and he has pretty good early aggression, but he becomes really strong once he has some mana, some MP5 that allows him to really spam his kit. In late game, he would technically be good with his ultimate and everything, but I'm not quite sure how that will play out with that current state of the ultimate, basically, and how it does damage and everything. So I feel like for now, he is not going to be a late game guard, and that might change when we get closer to his release or to a few patches down the road where it's been changed. Now, before we get started, I'm going to drink some milk, sponsored by no one. And now we're ready to go. That was very important. The first guard we have here is a prime example of a late game guard. Kali is not terrible in early game, I give her that, because with her 2 she still does a little bit, but overall she is designed for late game, and the best point of the game for her is definitely late game. If anyone wants to argue that she's more of a mid to late game guard, I would also agree with that. It's just somewhere in between that bracket, depending on how you want to put it. Anubis is more of an all-rounder in my opinion. Anubis is a situational pick in general. He's not necessarily what you would typically pick in most comps or anything, or a pub stomp guard rather, but he does that equally well at every level of the game. Like he does high amounts of damage in early game, but he still does high amounts of damage in late game. So that doesn't really dramatically change throughout. The next one is Odin. Odin is more of an early game, I would say maybe an early game to mid game character. He doesn't have the strongest level 1, for example. The bird bump is something he only has from level 2 onwards. And why I also want to put him to mid-game is because his ultimate stays relevant in later stages of the game, and he's often just picked for the ultimate rather than the rest of his kit. Ymir is an interesting one. I would say Ymir has a lot of early aggression and a lot of early damage potential. I'm not quite entirely sure if I would reserve him as a purely early game guard though. He's definitely not a late game guard in what his kit offers in terms of damage and everything. But again, I can see him making like a lot of useful plays off the wall and everything, and that is very disruptive to certain characters. So I would say maybe also a bit more early to mid game. You also pick him a little bit for the wall and not just for the early game damage. Zeus is probably also an all-rounder. Zeus has very, very, very high early game, don't get me wrong, but his damage doesn't necessarily fall off as long as he stays ahead. He's a very snowbally character, and on one hand, yes, he is probably one of the best early game guards, but he's also good in late game as long as you can keep up. And the team fight phase is still very potent for him, and he can insta-burst guard very well. Hunbatz is probably more of a mid to late game guard. So Hunbatz has not the very best super early game until level 5, even though he has recently gotten a very, very nice buff for him. But his ultimate will always be super late game focused for team fight phases, for contesting objectives and everything. So I would say he's mid to late game. Habois is another one of those that can do really well across all stages. He has super high early clear, super high early aggression. But then in mid game and in late game, he has this insane burst, and you kind of playing him to get to that point. So again, I would put him to the other super bursty mages here and say it's an all-rounder. Hades is very interesting. Hades I can't place with super high certainty. So Hades has an extremely strong early game through his sustain. But then he's also someone who can transition into better late game stages as well, depending on surrounding circumstances. And the utility that his ultimate can offer in that stage can be very good if you play him right, and you need the tanky items to really get to the point where that's the case. So maybe I will put him towards an early to mid game, maybe a bit more of a tendency towards mid game here than towards early game. Kukulkan, I would say, is definitely not an early game god. Now, the thing that Kukulkan has absolutely going for him is that he has super strong early clear, super safe early clear. He can just clear the wave with Tornado better than any other god, and that kind of makes him early game in a sense. But at the same time, in order to really get his damage going, you need a lot of mana, you need a lot of power. He's the only god where double stacking was warranted for a while, so you can't really say he's an early game god based on that. The more I think about it here and the more I listen to myself, basically, I would actually put him towards the all-rounders as well. Because with him, again, what he's got going in early game is a super safe clear. Doesn't have much early aggression though, whereas in late game he's got the super strong secure. But stat, it's awkward. Definitely not an early game god and definitely not a late game god. She's gonna be a mid game god, but she doesn't even do that to the degree that she's supposed to. For late game, her burst is often just not enough, and her catch just don't do enough. And in early game, her clear is just not enough. So she's somewhere in the middle, and probably one of the worst gods right now. Ra is also interesting. I think based on what Ra does, he's got a very strong early clear, but not the strongest. And he's got good early aggression, and he's got good team fighting through the heals, and he's got good objective secure. But I'm not quite sure if I would place him as much as an all-rounder as the others here. I would say Ra is overall a mid-game god. The point where you have a decent amount of power and where your snipes hit hard and you can rotate a lot through the extra mobility. That's the point where Ra really shines, and that's the mid-game. Rakne is definitely an early-game god. She's got a super good level 1 clear, and after that she's got extremely good gank potential, and she can really stay ahead and pressure enemies, and she can still be useful in late game, but her purpose is to get the team to late game and then just be like a supplementary damage dealer most of the time. And that's even what we see in the SPL right now, so I would be very certain with this placement here. Hell, a god I haven't really seen in a long time, but also someone I would say more towards late game. She also wants a few items to really get her kit going, even if you play in support, for example. And I would maybe put her in mid game, or maybe even possibly mid to late game. Maybe she's more of mid game. Hard to say. No, actually mid to late game. I'll say mid to late game. Vamana, interesting due to all the changes that he had, but he's someone who also wants a few items to really get the tankiness in his ultimate going. And overall, I would say he's a late game god, though he's not quite as late game as, say, Kali. He's got this peak where eventually other gods that are super late game can go through his protections, can go through his ultimate and everything, and that's where he kind of falls off again. So you can kind of argue between mid-late game and just mid-game here. I'll probably say mid-game based on his current stats. Agni is also a very mixed god. He's got very strong early clear as well through his flames. But then he's got very strong objective secure in late game and very strong pressure with the ultimate. I would say Agni is overall an all-rounder as well. Sobek is probably more of an early game to mid game god. He's got a decent potential late game still. He can still disrupt and he can still set up a very strong team fight with his pluck if he gets the right pluck. But overall, his kit is super scary during the laning phase between the pluck and the slow and self-sustain and high damage for a guardian and everything. Artemis is a late game god through and through, even after all the changes. Her laning phase and everything is not where she shines. It's when you get into late game, you just tusky everyone and you just crit them down basically, or you just burst them down if you're not going crit. In either scenario, that's where Artemis has her highest potential. Bakasura is technically a late game god like Kali when it comes to the design of his kit, but he can utilize a lot of his aggression earlier on. He's not as focused on being in late game already, basically, and sustains better, invades better, and everything. So I would say overall he's a mid game god. His level 1 is not that great, but after that he picks up pretty quickly. Guan Yu, hard to say. I would say he's overall an all-rounder. He's got the good early clear under certain circumstances, but if you can get disrupted or not, he's got that sustain. But he's also a great team fighting god with his heal. At the same time, his ultimate is kind of hard to utilize like ideally in late game, so somewhere in between. Anhur, I would say, is a early game focused character overall, though he's gotten some buffs to his ultimate that allow him to shine at a little bit later stages of the game. I'm tempted to put him just into early game, but with the disclaimer that he can still work in later stages. Not like he's suddenly terrible, but early game aggression is where he really goes. But I have a few other hunters in mind where I'm thinking maybe they are more the prime example of an early game aggression hunter. No, but Anhur is good enough. He just transitions decently into other stages, even though he's an early game god. Cupid is probably a mid-game god, an early to mid-game god. He doesn't have the best clear, depending on how you can place the minions. The aggression depends a lot on that as well. And his ultimate is very situational and can be good in certain comps and cannot be good in other comps. But I would say overall, yeah, I would say early to mid-game, leaning a little bit more towards mid-game. Thor is an all-rounder in a sense because he has higher damage early on and higher clear and everything. And in late game, he becomes more of a utility-based god, but I think the utility-based version of him is not as strong as the early game version. So I would say he's early to mid-game, a lot of him depending on having his ultimate up as well. And that's something you only get after a certain point of the game, which is why he's not an early game god. Ares, on the other hand, definitely an early game god. Super high aggression early. Not super high clear compared to some other gods, but the damage that he has from that point of the game makes up for it. And then he has to stay ahead the whole time to really have an impact on the game. Freya, I find kind of hard to place with all the changes going on with her and everything. I can't really say what she is right now because there's really no point of the game where she does poorly, I think. So I would just say she's an all-rounder. She's got good clear early on and she's got good pressure later. And even if her clear's a little bit worse, she's still going to be good overall. Loki. Definitely not an early game god. All he does is passive farm until a certain point. But then is he really a late game god? Because in super late game, there are other gods that are better. I would say he's probably like a mid to late game god. He needs a few items to really come online, and he needs the enemies to not have built too much defense yet to really be effective. Bacchus. Bacchus used to be super late game. Now I would say he is not anymore because the changes that he's gotten allow for a lot more earlier stages of aggression, and especially through Chug, this is more possible. And I would say he's maybe somewhere around mid-game overall. He still does nicely anywhere in the game, but he's not like a complete all-rounder that will do the same impact in very early and very late. Fenrir is definitely towards early, especially with his changes that he received. He's a little bit better at transitioning into mid-game as well, though, so I will say he's an early to mid-game god. In late game, he's mostly there for his ultimate, which is still very useful, but it doesn't make him a late game god overall, I would say. Hercules is probably, all things considered, a mid-game god. Also someone who enjoys having a few items going, but at the same time, he has a lot of early aggression if you can get it off. So that's hard to say. He's not a late game god in the traditional sense, but he can hold his own in late game very well as well. So it depends a lot on how you build as well against the enemy team. Having a bit of trouble with this one, I'm gonna say maybe more of an early to mid game guard, because that's when his combo really hurts, and he's not as much of a distraction character. But we've seen recently in the SPL that playstyle also works, and he can also work in late game that way. Xbalanque still definitely more of a late game guard. He wants his stacks. He wants ideally make use of his ultimate with his team and everything. If I'm putting him into whole late game next to Artemis, I think he gets online a little bit earlier than Artemis. So I want to put him more in mid to late game, just from the perspective that right now he has a lot of potential to go ham earlier in the game than Artemis would be able to. But that's also like partially because he's just a top hunter in the current meta. So I will leave him at a mid to late game here, but with a disclaimer, it's definitely more towards late game. Vulcan, I would say, is a mid game guard, or maybe even an all-rounder. The turret doesn't do as much late game, so that's a bit of a downside for him, depending on how quickly the enemy team can burst in, and at the same time his ultimate still does a lot for secures and everything. But I think in mid game is where he really shines, when you get that ult off and the turret still works on its own to zone enemies off and everything. Neath is a traditional early game guard in every sense of what you can be: early burst, early sustain, early lane clear, early pressure. What more do you need? Poseidon probably... Poseidon has an interesting transition into late game, because he can sometimes focus a little bit more on those basic attack force build, and that actually helps him a lot to keep up in DPS more than some other mages can. So I'll actually put Poseidon as an all-rounder here, because in early game you obviously have the Kraken. Aphrodite, more towards late game, I would say. She's maybe around the same level as the mid to late game guards here. At the beginning you're really just farming and healing up, but she can eventually do a little bit more than a pure late game guard. Apollo, also probably mid game. Early game he's not the strongest, and once he gets farming he can keep up decent pressure in lane, and there's always a threat of him ulting around, but in late game that is less of a threat when teams are together, unless you purely focus on split pushing. Naja, on one hand a very strong early game guard, on the other hand, if you can keep up the pace of the game, the ultimate still does better in later stages. I would say in very late game he's very nice to make a single pick out of the enemy team, but that doesn't always happen, that doesn't always work. So I'm kind of tempted to put him more towards early to mid game, with the note that he's still a threat in late game if he gets a good pick anyways. But at the same time, actually putting him as an all-rounder is also absolutely fair. Isis is probably a mid game guard. In early game she can do like a lot through her clear. It's pretty solid, it's pretty strong clear. But really once you have the ultimate and you work a little bit more with your team, that's when it works the best. In late game she's very easy to single out, because she has very few ways to get away. Athena is definitely more towards early stages of the game as well, with her ultimate allowing for rotations before the team fight phase really happens. Her taunt is still good in late game, that's what bridges her over, but really early to mid game is where she's the best in my opinion. Kronos is late game through and through. Literally has a passive that makes him stronger the longer the game goes. What else do you need to say? That's just him by design. Chang'e is another one of those cards where I think she's very much leaning towards late game. Actually, I would say she's even a little more late game than Aphrodite. The later the game goes, the better for Chang'e really, and the better her kit becomes. So I would say late game guard. Tyr, more of an early game guard that then has a harder time transitioning, and the level 1 is super strong. I'm almost tempted to put him into purely early game actually. He can still do things later for sure, like not to discredit him as any early game guard, but I think especially with level 1 having extreme pressure already, and then from level 2 on he's a massive threat in the lane, that is an early game guard. Xionghui, definitely more of the farming type, more of a late game, maybe mid to late game actually, because in super late game, enemies shred him a little bit too quickly. Mercury also definitely more on the late game side, kind of somewhere between Bakasura and Kali in when he comes online. He doesn't really need a full build to be effective. As long as he has some crit items and everything, he can still do a lot of damage, so I will say a mid to late game guard more than a pure late game guard. Thanatos is an early game guard. He has ways to be effective in late game as well, but overall, he's just super early game. Level 1 Scythe hits super hard. Sun Wukong, also probably more of an early game guard. His impact falls off towards late game. I would say his super early game is not the strongest point. I would say like a little bit into the game is where he really shines. So I would say early to mid game. Amuzan Cub, probably an all-rounder actually. As long as he's left alone, he's always frustrating to fight. He's always annoying to deal with. So I will say he is more towards the bottom here, towards the all-rounders. This is not after late game. This is just all throughout the game. And then we have Nuwa. Nuwa is also interesting. Definitely not an early game guard. She needs some farm. She needs the ultimate. She needs the items. Maybe mid-game? Maybe mid to late? I would say mid to late. In late, she's got some issues where she can get picked out too easily as well, which make her impact fall off a little bit. But the vision is still very nice that she can provide, so I would say mid to late. Chuck, early game through and through. Unfortunately, that's where he belongs, and after that, his impact falls off drastically, even after various changes. And we've seen it over and over. It just doesn't really work for him. And then we have Gap. Gap, I think, is probably an all-rounder. His shield is just good at any point of the game. It doesn't matter if it's early, if it's late. And even though he doesn't have the super high early pressure, he keeps the lane safe until you get to the point where you can do whatever you need to do. So technically, he's maybe more of a late game guard, but just being able to so easily support, I think, makes him an all-rounder. Nemesis is not an all-rounder. Nemesis early game is still not as strong as her late game, even though her early game got buffed a lot. I would say maybe, at this point we could probably call her a mid-game guard. She's not purely late game anymore. She doesn't need a ton of items to do what she does at this point. Items like Crusher, for example, make her work very differently from how she used to work. And she's maybe more of a tendency here towards late game as well. Now maybe move her down here. But I'd say she's still like closer to mid game than she's to late game. Scylla, also late game. You want to farm as much as you can with Scylla to really do damage, but at the same time, her Crush already does a lot of damage with a few items, and if you get a good ult off at the right point of the game, it's still going to hurt a lot. So I'd say a little bit more mid to late game than pure late game. Uller, on the other hand, is absolutely up here. He's absolutely an early game guard, and that's why I was tempted to put Anhur a little bit lower, because Uller just has this super early high aggression that then gradually falls off throughout the game, and you kind of have to compensate for it. Kumbhakana. Hard to say. He's just always a nuisance, I would say, always disrupting from level 2 essentially until the end of the game. He's got pretty good clear. He can kind of take a target out. I think he doesn't really have a strong or weak point like other guards do, and I would say he's more of an all-rounder right here. Janus needs some farm to get going. Before that, it's just he's still a good clearer, but not the best. And in very late game, I think other mages are more impactful in terms of what they can do with their ultimates, secure and everything. But at the same time, the potential of Janus to just drop in on you unexpectedly is, of course, still very, very strong. So maybe a mid game is actually where he belongs, really. Osiris, an early game guard overall, but I think due to the fact that you want to have a little bit of itemization going to make him even more effective than his level 1 is, I would put him more to early to mid game. His early game is still super strong, but doesn't slap quite as hard as a super ability based guard in many situations. As long as you don't position very poorly against him, you still have to watch out a lot against him, of course. Ram is, on the other hand, very late game. the question is really, is he as late game as Artemis? And I would say no, he's not quite as late game as Artemis. He can do things before Artemis does very effectively. The ultimate is also something you have to keep track of at most points. So I'd say he's a bit more mid to late game. Serket, there's no point of the game where Serket is weak. Serket is definitely an all-rounder. She has early aggression through very quick clear and very good control already, and then her ultimate with a true damage will always be effective into the late stage of the game, so she is an all-rounder as well. Bracken has this very strong level 1, and then he kind of doesn't have that much after that for a while, and then becomes more effective again, and then becomes less effective again. So maybe overall he's a early to mid-game guard, but he can do well later on as well, depending on the build and everything. Sylvanus, also an interesting character, as the sustain allows him to be good at pretty much any point of the game, and his ultimate is a very good setup at any point of the game, and his early game clear through his basics is also super strong. I would say this guy goes down here into an all-rounder category. Ao Kuang, not an all-rounder, more of a late game focused character. Basically with Ao Kuang, the more items you have, the better, but also you don't have to go all the way to super late game for him to be effective. He can do that earlier, so I would say mid to late game. Nox, her super early is not the best. You need to get going with some items and everything, and I think her late game is nice, but there are better late games. So I would say she is just around mid game right here. Willish has been changed a fair bit. She used to be a super early god. I don't think that's quite the case anymore. I think she's more of an early to mid game god at this point, as she is very mana hungry, and actually the current meta helps here with the speed buff, so she has more mobility. But if you, for example, have a single mana item, be it Traveler's like Talaria or Hydra's Lament, that will drastically boost how much rotation capabilities you have with her, how much you can spam her abilities, and that, I think, makes it a bit more mid-game than just purely early game compared to what she used to be. She's still very early game though, but not quite as much as before. Hou Yi, probably a mid-game god. Doesn't do a whole lot of things super early. It has to build up his pressure and everything, but then also doesn't do crazy things in late game most of the time. So in mid game, like some 1v1s in jungle, that's where he would be best. Bellona. Bellona is actually a pretty good bully at the start of the game, but she can be very disruptive to certain comps, even in late game, with her disarm and with her ultimate, and with the ever lingering threat of the damage that she can do, or for example, building her with Frostbound to take someone out of the fight, basically. So I think Bellona is here with the all-rounders. Medusa is an ability-based god, and she's designed more towards early game, but she is not really super early game. Her clear in the early stages is not the best, so I would say she is overall maybe more of an early to mid-game or even mid-game god. I'm a bit indecisive here, but I would say, based on the fact how much she can do with the ultimate in mid-game, she's maybe more of a mid-game god. Apuash, his level 1 is alright, but not the best, and he really comes online from level 3 onwards, but he also wants to have certain items to work really well, but you don't have to go all the way into late game for that to be the case. So I would say he's also around mid game. Ratatoskr, probably an all-rounder. He's very effective in early game right now because of the Acorn, with everyone else having less movement speed in the jungle. He doesn't really suffer from that, and he can just build it while on the run, and his ultimate will always be impactful throughout the whole game. Even though he's not quite as good in late game as he is in earlier stages, I would say he's good enough, maybe. Unless, unless I say I'm tempted to put him early to mid game, or to put him as an all-rounder. Because like thinking about it, he doesn't have the same late game as for example, has as many of the other more AA focused assassins. Having a hard time with this one, to be honest. I will put him an all-rounder with a bit of a question mark, because you could also justify him not being that late game if you wanted to. Another god that we have here is Raven. Raven is probably more of an early game god. He has that. He's one of the few early game junglers basically that still does a lot of damage until a certain point of the game. But at the same time, I wouldn't say his highest aggression is on level 1. I think it's once you have his abilities, basically. So around level 5 is where he really gets going. So I would say he's early to mid-game. Then we have Capri. Capri in the laning phase clears okay, but he doesn't really do all too much. He's not a crazy laner, in my opinion. Doesn't have the aggression that some other supports have, for example. At the same time, in late game, he's so different from other supports that it's hard to say. His ult will always have viability. I think he's maybe just there with Gap, just in the same boat where he kind of just stays relevant throughout the game for different reasons, and mainly due to his ultimate just making your allies more survivable. And then we have Sol. I would say Sol is a mid to late game god. She has got ability damage and early and everything, but the more items you get with her, the better she becomes, the more impact she has on the game. So yeah, mid to late game, it's where it's at. We have Chiron. Chiron, more of an ability-based hunter, which is interesting, who often is played in mid as well. And with his playstyle, I would say he's overall a mid-game character who transitions very well into a late game, though, and who still does good things early as well. So he's just a bit untraditional how you play him compared to other hunters. Skadi, not really a late game character in that sense. I would say somewhere between early game and early to mid game. Her level 1 is not the same as Neath, basically, or like her first few levels are not the same as Neath. So I would say a bit more early to mid game than Neath is. Amaterasu, most definitely more towards late game. You want to farm up, you want to get your items, you want to get your utility, your high impact. I would say actually she is just a late game god. You can have impact in mid to late game as well, but another god where the longer the game goes, the better she becomes, really. Raijin. He's had a few shifts basically in when he is the strongest. At the moment, I would say he's a solid god throughout most stages. I wouldn't say he's the best in level 1. I would say I put him around S. So he is good. S, right, mid-game. Getting a bit lost here. He's good in mid-game mostly, and that's a little bit less in early, and is not the super most impactful god in late game under all circumstances. Jingwei, also definitely a more late game oriented god, but I would say not quite as late game as Artemis is. Can have an impact a little bit early on in the game, but also in late game she has the issues that she can't do the aggressive dashes as often, so that becomes a bit more of a downside that is not yet an issue in mid game or mid to late game. Then we have Susano. Susano, I would say somewhere around mid game. He is not the best in late game. He doesn't always have the capability to burst his enemies. In early game, he definitely needs a bit of farm to get going, because his early clear isn't great anymore at all. So yeah, mid game it is. Fafnir is absolutely a late game support through and through. The longer the game goes, the better for him, because that gives him a lot of extra stuff that he can work with. And it also means that his ultimate will have a bigger impact. If you go on the Dragon farm and you can burn an objective with your team through the 2, that's massive for him. Lang Shen, more of a early to mid game god overall. He's good in early game. He's got decent damage going, but really after some items becomes a little better. And in late game, he just can't keep up with traditional AA gods like Kali. He just doesn't do the same damage at this point anymore. So yeah, early to mid game it is. Terra is a little bit more towards all stages, I would say. In early game, she's not super strong. She needs some farm to have her first abilities, to have her first combos, basically. So level 1, for example, is not that strong. But then at least by the time she gets her ultimate, she becomes very impactful. Though she's often played in solo at the moment, and in solo her ultimate doesn't matter that much at that point yet, and it becomes more relevant in the team fight phase. So maybe I will put her towards mid to late game, because that's when really her whole kit can shine. Whereas beforehand it's more about surviving to get everything going, though that's a bit different in support. Like her power curve depends on if you play in support or in solo, and I will just leave her here for her overall impact, basically. Izanami, probably a mid-game god. She has decent ability damage, and in late game she's kind of awkward in many situations. And in early game, she does have. Actually, we put it up a little bit because she has the early game clear, the early game pressure that works for her. Though I'm still under the impression that in many situations she can't really play off that. She just has that and then she clears and that's it. But yeah, I would say that makes her early to mid game. Camazotz, another interesting one. I would say overall Camazotz is an early game guard. He's similar threat to Thanatos in early stages. But he also becomes more of a threat if he levels up in some ways, especially when he gets the ultimate, when he gets multiple ranged abilities. And then just, I would say, all right, what point of the game does he really struggle? I'm not sure. He doesn't go fully into late game, so I would say it stops a bit before that. So I would say he's more of an early game guard than anything else, and then just has a good transition until mid game, and after that falls off a little bit. I'm going to have to check why my charger's not charging here. 1 second. And there we go. We're back. I just had to make sure that we don't have my laptop dying on the last few guards here. Sloth, I would say, is not an early game guard anymore because his early game clear is not that good. In late game, he doesn't have the same impact as many others quite often as well. So maybe he's more of a mid game guard at this point, though he doesn't really excel at that either. Nike, the longer the game goes, the better, especially for her passive. And she transitions very, very well into late game, though she does have an impact through her passive in earlier stages already. You can't really neglect that part. Her own kit is never going to be huge for anything, but that's not the purpose of playing Nike. Morrigan. Well, she needs a few levels to get going, but after that it completely depends on what guards are on both teams, though she does have a tendency to work a little bit better in later stages of the game because her cooldowns are shorter and she can utilize leads from certain guards better, and she has the abilities leveled equally. Like in level 20, she doesn't have the issue anymore that she can basically have abilities misleveled on certain guards. If she levels her 2 and then just has Thor's stun level, that doesn't really help her. So maybe I would say she's overall a mid to late game guard, even though she does have her perks in early stages too. Kuzenbo. I would say he's a traditional mid game guard. He's not the craziest in late game, even though his reflect's very nice. Not super crazy in early, though his early is still very nice with the kappas at least. Builds a lot of pressure against certain guards, but it just depends. Also, pushing someone through the wave can be very, very impactful. It also depends, however. If they don't do the positioning for that, then that impact just falls flat. Krononos. Not early game, definitely not, but also not really late game. I think he's just mid game as well. Like, in super late game, there are just other hunters that are better. In super early game, there are other hunters that are better. He's just somewhere in between. Ganesh. With how little he sees in terms of play at the moment, maybe hard to judge. I would say Ganesh has the very good pressure actually with his assist to his allies clear as well. He has got a very good way of getting the ADC ahead by automatically doing it, which is unique in its own right. And in late game, in very late game, it might be a little bit too easy to avoid his ultimate. But that depends on the guard as well. Like, it depends on the comp that was picked. So, where do we put him? Do we put him as an all-rounder? I think he's got a few too many weak spots for that. I think I'll put him more towards mid-game. Maybe a little more tendency towards early to mid-game than towards late game here. And yeah, that should be an overall outcome that's alright for him. Daji. Daji does not have a great early game. It takes quite a while for her to get going. And in late game, she has high impact through the ultimate, though her kit in general is easier to punish in late game because she has to get close for a lot of her damage, and she can be disrupted by so many enemies in a team fight with a 2. She can't just jump in on the enemies easily. So I would say overall she is a mid-game guard that has a tendency to do better in late game depending on the comp. Kokulin. Used to be very early game, I think that fell off a bit. I think he's more of an all-rounder, actually. I think he's still got early game aggression, but his ultimate especially and his berserk form keep him relevant way until late game, because he's just got so much CC going, so much disruption, AoE damage that you can never really ignore. So I would say he's just an all-rounder. Artio. More of an early game guard. She has not super bursty early, but for like a support style character, she does a lot in early. But she also works well in mid game, and especially if you play her in solo, I think her mid game is actually a little bit better. So I would say she's a mid game guard. She's kind of all rounder ish, but she falls off too much late game for me to consider an all rounder, because she just doesn't have the same setup that other, especially supports have, but also if you play a solo. So I would say that's where she belongs. Hachiman is late game overall, I would say, but he's not super late game, and his early is also not bad. And with how he's played right now, I think it's more the late game where he really does the work. Maybe mid game. Maybe Hachiman is mid game because he can do well enough in mid game, and then mid to late. Mid game. I'm struggling with this one. I'm having a very hard time making a choice here because of how his kit works and how certain parts of his kits are different at different stages. We put him in mid game. Discordia. Her ultimate is basically designed for late game team fights, but her early is also not bad. At the same time, her super early is not the best, so I would say she's maybe also more of a all-rounder type. Even though she doesn't have the super best early, she gets online early enough for that to be warranted. Cerberus. Cerberus has a lot of early pressure, a lot of early aggression that he can utilize. His ultimate makes him very relevant in late game teamfights, but it's like a lot easier to avoid than a Sylvanas ban, so maybe more of an early to mid game guard overall. Achilles is an all-rounder, and that's because of his execute. He's got high early damage, but if you play him tanky, for example, he can go into late game. He's also got very good burst potential on squishy's late game if you go for a full damage build. So I would say all-rounder is justified here. Would go for Than as well to some degree, but Achilles just does better without the execute even in late game. Chernobog, mid game. Not the best early, but in mid game he has the global ult that helps out a lot. In late game, other ults just work a little bit better. Baron Samedi used to be early game, mid game, and everything, but now his early is not that strong anymore. He's more towards the later stages of the game, without wanting to go too late, because then he loses more damage. I would say he's more of a... I would say either mid game or mid to late game, because in late game he has more risks with the ultimate, but depending on how you build him, especially with a bruiser build, he can really hold his own in later stages. So I will say mid to late game. Really depends on the build. He could also easily be a mid game guard. Pele. I'm almost tempted to say all-rounder. I think Pele doesn't really have a weak time in the game, and I think that's the reason why she can even compete along with the movement speed at the moment against like most of these AA guards and everything. She gets shut down easier in late game, but she still has enough damage potential to justify going all the way to late game with her and picking her for that as well. Whereas her early game is super strong. Well, what is the conclusion of that? Maybe we just say, maybe we just put her towards all-rounder. It's also like, I could say mid-game, but I think she does everything kind of well. Hera. Hera has a lot of potential as soon as she has Argus, and eventually you get to a point where Argus just gets burnt too quickly, but it takes quite a while to get there. So I would say she is a mid-game god overall. King Arthur is everything right now. He's too all-rounder, but he needs his Gladiator Shield to really get to full effectiveness. That's important. He has a bit of a weaker stage before that, but it's not weak enough to really not say he's an all-rounder, so I would still put him as an all-rounder overall. Merlin, probably in a similar boat. He's just got a lot of things going on in the early game already. Good clear, good utility in terms of what he can do, good safety. And then the longer the game goes, the better for him. So I would say he's also an all-rounder, so far at least. Last but not least, we have Jormungandr. I would say his late game is not his strongest, and the super early is also not the strongest. I think he is a typical mid-game god overall, actually. If you want to know where Set and Horus are placed, I already talked about that at the beginning of the video, so you can skip back to that if you skipped here to find out where they are. And we can have a look at these here real quick again. So these are early game gods, super high aggression or super high clear or both, or just no strong point after that, looking at this guy. Then we have our early to mid game, also very focused on high early aggression, but transition a little bit better into later stages, or maybe lead like 1 or 2 levels to really get going. Like for example, Fenrir is better on level 2 than he's on level 1, when he has 2 abilities to really do damage. And then in mid game, we have gods that just are either just simply best at that point of the game, or just kind of transition around this area and kind of expand a little bit towards earlier stages and later stages as well, but are maybe not designed for the earliest and latest stages. Then mid to late game, I got that have some sort of impact in mid game, Cecilia, for example, or Mercury, but get better after that even. Shankui, for example, would be a good one for this as well. And then in late game, we have the gods that really focus on late game. Like, again, I could argue Kali being mid to late game as well, because it would really work for it too. And all these guys can do something before we get to late game, right? None of them is terrible and powerless, but their best times are when you're in late game. And then you have the all-rounders that are just generally somewhat similarly good through all stages of the game, or have maybe like one weak spot in the game where they really aren't as effective, but overall just tend to perform very well no matter what, where, and when you play them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're overpowered. Like, for example, a Pele may be strong at all stages of the game, but that doesn't mean that she will beat a Kali in late game. Or same for, say, for example, an AMC, but doesn't mean it beats an Artemis in late game anymore. It just means that they are these guys that can just do something at any point and are good at something at any point, which is not always the same thing as well. When you look at, for example, Kukulkan, who's got very good clear in early game and then very good objective secure in late game, but not like super consistent aggression through all stages. So yeah, again, if you're clicking all the way to the end, this is not a tier list. These are just the labels for the different stages of the game these gods belong in. And I hope I covered this thoroughly for all gods now. Thanks, yeah. Sorry for the slightly budget quality. Still a bit temporary and for some background noise maybe. But that should be fixed soon. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one. Probably tomorrow. I probably release a set guide. DukeSloth out.